Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I'll try and do in my presentation is to try and put this in an international perspective. I mean, of course, there are important things going on in the UK, Brexit, etc., and that's obviously a big concern in the near future. But I think it's important not to forget about these wider trends that are going on and that are affecting all countries. And I think this is an area where countries can learn from one another. So hopefully this is what my presentation will do here. So, I mean, I'll briefly go over some of the key challenges we were already mentioned by Maya earlier on. I mean, the big one that people are talking about, sorry, this is a little bit small, but I'll talk to the graph and explain. The big one that people are worried about is technology, of course. We feel that technology, or the change in technology, is accelerating. It's becoming pervasive in our work lives, in our daily lives. I mean, this graph shows you the growth in the worldwide supply of robots. It was around 80,000 in 2003. By 2020, it will be 500,000 a year, robots being supplied worldwide. And we've also heard about the rise in artificial intelligence and what it can do, its capabilities, its applicabilities. The second big trend, I would say, is demographic change. Across the OECD, on average, we will see, I mean, right now we have around 4 people of working age population supporting every older person. In 35 years' time, that will be half. We'll only have 2 people supporting every person, older person. This will obviously have big implications as these cohorts retire in terms of skills needs. And the third big trend, or at least has been a big trend, is that the world has become much more interconnected. Of course, we don't know what the future brings, in particular in this trend, but we know that jobs in a particular country depend to a large extent on demand from abroad. This shows you that in the UK, for instance, just under a third of jobs in the business sector depend on demand from abroad. Now, all this, of course, is having an impact on the labor market. The big one that people are talking about, the big worry, is automation. Some people think that in the next 10 to 20 years, 1 in 2 jobs could be automated. We think that's a little bit too negative a view, because it's unlikely that entire occupations can be automated. We've rarely seen in the past entire occupations disappear. Yes, occupations change. There's tasks, specific tasks that change. And so when we take this approach and look at the tasks that people carry out as part of a job, we estimate that around 14% of jobs are at high risk of automation. That's still a significant portion. But on top of that, there's about a third of jobs that will undergo significant change. Tasks will change a lot, and people will have to adapt on the job. Sorry, yes, that should have been animated. The second big point is that technology is allowing new forms of work to emerge. We see crowdwork, so work that's carried out entirely online, but online platforms also facilitate the kind of people finding jobs and kind of gig work, which is carried out in the real world often, but not always, sometimes online. In many ways, this is a great development. It increases flexibility for employers, it increases flexibility for employees. Some people don't want to be restricted by strict hours that they get in a regular job. It improves matching in the labor market, so it should increase flexibility efficiency. But there's also concerns around job quality, and I'll come back to this in a second. When we talk about automation and offshoring, etc., we worry often about job losses. Of course, new jobs are also being created. And in fact, what we see across most OECD countries is that the employment rates have been increasing for the past few decades. So generally, it's a positive story. But what we also see is that the jobs that are being created are not the same as the jobs that are disappearing. I mean, generally what we see is that there's growth in the share of high-skilled jobs, but the jobs in the middle-skilled jobs are disappearing, or at least they're shrinking as a share of total employment. These are often routine jobs that can be automated, or jobs that can be offshored. And we also see simultaneously small growth in the share of low-skilled jobs. So we see this polarization of the labor market. Now, all these trends are contributing to rises in inequality. Inequality in the OECD, on average, is now at the highest point for 50 years, and it keeps growing. 25 years ago, the richest 10% in society had an income that was 7 times higher of those of the lowest 10%. Now, this is 9 times higher, and it keeps increasing. And this is where we need to worry about the sustainability of our models. This is where we really need to think what impact technology, demographic change, etc. are having, and whether the policies and institutions that we have in place are adequate to deal with these trends. So that brings me on to the second half of my presentation, and which is the policy side. Now, right, I heard people laugh because I think calling someone a Luddite is kind of a derogatory term in many ways. We kind of laugh at these people. But I think it's important to remember that these people had jobs that were disappearing. These were people who had families, they had kids to feed, they had a mortgage to pay. Well, I'm not sure they had mortgages back then, but they had bills to pay. And there wasn't any government support. In fact, the policy response was to hang a few of them or to shoot a few of them. Now, I'm not by any means saying that we should start smashing Google, Facebook, etc. I'm not also saying that we should start shooting and hanging people. But what I'm saying is that the policy response is really, really important. And the policy response will depend a lot on the political response that we're seeing. I mean, we've seen Brexit. The First Minister mentioned it. People are reacting to certain trends. People have real concerns. Same with Trump in the United States. Technological change is displacing a lot of people, and so there are real concerns. And it's important that we get the politics and the policies right to manage these changes. So I'll just focus on 4 key areas. The first one is skills. We know that technological change is accelerating, and it means that the use-by date of our skills is shortening. And at the same time, our working lives are getting longer, so we really need opportunities for people and incentives for people to maintain their skills, upskill, reskill throughout their working lives. Now, generally we see that jobs are, or the new jobs that are emerging are more highly skilled. So in a way that is very good news. They're more productive jobs, higher value jobs. The concern is that people's skills are really quite low. This is a graph from the OECD survey of adult skills. We tested adults in numeracy skills and literacy skills. We also tested them on solving problems on computers, using computers. And doing this, we found that 50% of people across the OECD, they can use a mouse, they can use a browser, but they struggle using them to find information. So they lack the basic skills needed in society, in work today. And on top of that, there were about 10% of people who cannot even use computers at all, have no experience using computers. This paints a very, very worrying picture. I mean, there was a report published last week by the OECD which used the literacy and numeracy tests of the survey of PIAC, Survey of Adult Skills, and asked a panel of experts to what extent they thought that AI could respond to the questions. And the good news is that there are tasks or questions that AI cannot do yet. The bad news is that most people can't do them either. In fact, there's only 11% of people who are safe from the kind of, from what AI could do already. So we need to be particularly worried about the low-skilled. We need to skill them, upskill them. But again, here we see a very worrying picture. You see the difference between the triangles, which are the participation in adult learning of the high-skilled compared to the very lowest skilled. And you see a huge gap. Yes, it's the lowest skilled people who are most likely to be displaced. They're least likely to find a new job as a result. And they're least likely to find, or at least take advantage of the opportunities that are arising as a result of the megatrends that I've discussed earlier. Now, there's an additional concern here, is that we have these new forms of work emerging. If people are moving jobs more frequently, there are reduced incentives for employers to invest in people, and similarly for people to invest in their own skills. And we may need new tools. Again, this is where it's important to learn from other countries. In France, they have something called the individual training account, where you build up rights to training every year, and the low-skilled get more training, even the self-employed get training rights. And the important thing is you can transfer these training rights from one employer to another, so they're an individual account kind of system. Whether it works, I don't know, but it's an interesting idea. The second point is labor market regulation. I mean, I talked earlier about these new forms of work emerging. We don't know very much about them, but they do seem to be growing very quickly. Yet, generally, the estimates suggest they're a relatively small share of overall employment. I think in one way, I've already said they're great, but there are real concerns because many of these people, they work short stints. They often do low-paid work. And what I said earlier is that these categories of work have kind of emerged at the fringes of labor market regulation. And we struggle to know what to do with them because many of these people don't have access to the standard rights and protections that we've developed for full-time, dependent, permanent employees. So this is where we struggle, and there are various policy recommendations. I mean, of course, Matthew is an expert on these issues, but sometimes it's just a matter of enforcing existing legislation, which we don't do effectively. Sometimes it's about removing loopholes, ambiguity, perhaps creating new employment categories. Whether or not that's a good idea is debatable. Or we could look at individual rights and protections and see whether or not we can extend them on an individual basis and make sure that everybody is covered. Now, I do want to make one important point, is that non-standard forms of employment are not new. 15.6% of people across the OECD are self-employed. If you look at people in dependent employment, 16% are in part-time employment, and 13.5% are in temporary contracts. And often we struggle even with those kind of people to make sure that they have the necessary rights and protections. But usefully, I think the platform economy, or the rise of the platform economy, has made us focus on these issues a bit more. Third point, and I think this is a nice example of what I've just said, is social protection. We worry about social protection. It's important social protection, especially if there are all these changes in the labor market. We need to support people to find new jobs, and they need that income support. Otherwise, they fall into poverty or may struggle to have the means to find a new job. Now, I want to focus on the self-employed because I'm not saying, for instance, that the platform workers are self-employed. There are too many litigations going on for me to be able to say that. But for better or worse, they are often classified as a self-employed. And so it's interesting, it's informative to look at the self-employed. So what this graph shows you is that, so it shows you a number of protections. The dark green faces show you where the self-employed have full protection, just like any other, or like dependent employees. The green faces are where they have partial protection. Orange faces is where they could opt into a system. And red means they have no protection whatsoever. And there's a number of points that this graph makes. Is that, first of all, for some kinds of protections, we do relatively well. Old age, invalidity, parental benefits, sickness benefits, these self-employed are relatively well protected. When it comes to accidents at work and unemployment benefits, we do far worse. We struggle. But the other point to make is that some countries manage to do it. The Nordic countries, whereas other countries do a little bit worse. This is all about legal access to social protection. In practice, of course, even if you have legal access, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have the protection because it depends on your contribution history, it depends on your earnings, thresholds, etc. And in practice, we know that across the EU, 55% of the self-employed, if they lose their job or their income, will not have access to unemployment benefits. 38% of them will not have access to sickness benefits. And among women, 46% of them will not have maternity benefits. There's obviously gaps in our social protection system. The final point I want to make is the point about social dialogue. It was already mentioned by the First Minister. We need to do things collectively. I think social dialogue is, first of all, important in terms of social partners can play an important role in helping workers transition from declining industries or occupations to new emerging ones. But I also think, and it was mentioned earlier on, is that there's nothing inevitable about the future. We can shape this future, and I think we do it through social dialogue. But here again, we see a worrying pattern because the very institutions that could help us shape the future and decide what future we want are being eroded. This graph shows you unionization rates across the OECD, and you can see that they're falling in all countries. Except I think Belgium, my own country, and Italy for some strange reason. But in most countries we see an erosion. The very megatrends that I discussed earlier, including the emergence of new forms of work, are contributing to this. We are struggling, for instance, with new forms of work, how to give them workers' voice. In many cases, people are classified as independent workers. We cannot organize them. Unions cannot reach out to these people because that would be against competition law. It would be forming a cartel. So there's issues in our existing legislation, but also maybe we need to think about new forms of workers' voice. And I want to say it's not just on the employee side, it's also on the employer side. This shows you the employer organization density, so how representative employers are. And again, in many countries we struggle, especially we struggle to represent small and medium-sized enterprises. But also, as we see a shift from manufacturing to services, we often struggle to represent the service sector adequately in employer organizations. So just one final point that they asked me to mention is we talk a lot about the future of work. I think there's a lot of big statements, and the question is, are these really backed up by facts? So at the OECD, we have a big program of work ongoing. In 2019, we'll publish a big publication, which will, on the one hand, describe what is actually happening in the labor market. I mean, there's a number of questions. Is it true that labor market mobility is increasing? Are we actually seeing this? In fact, I can give you a preview, is we're not seeing that. We're seeing the opposite, because populations age. But what we are seeing is that among young people, labor market mobility is increasing. So the young generations are not the same as 10, 20 years ago. And this has important implications for skills acquisition, for wage growth, for social protection. We talk about these middle-skilled workers, and their share is shrinking. What is happening to these workers? Are they shifting to higher-skilled jobs, or are they just disappearing out of the labor market? Again, a big question. And related to that is the middle class shrinking. A very important point I want to make is employment rates overall are rising. That's good, but are we seeing more underemployment, involuntary part-time? It's great if we all work fewer hours and if that's a choice, but if it's not a choice and some people are being pushed into underemployment, then we have a problem. What's happened to real wage growth? And one final point is, of course, we're looking at the kind of policy side as well and what countries are doing, and we're hoping to start a big new program of work, notably in new forms of work, and how countries across the OECD are responding to these new forms of work. So I'll stop here. I may have talked a little bit too long. No, okay. So thank you very much for your attention.